You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Walmart Business is in the business of saving you time, money, and hassle. Whether your business started in a garage or is a garage, Walmart Business has the tools to help you get where you're going. Tools like free shipping, multi-user accounts, and just about any item your company needs.
Even a double filtration cyclone dust collector.
Yep, even that.
Sweet.
Walmart Business. It's the Walmart you love. Now for your business. Learn more at business.walmart.com. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by MGM Plus. From and its Horrors returns for Season 4, centered around a town that traps all those who enter. Terrifying creatures that come out at night. Horrors some wished had stayed buried. Where desperate hope leads to darker truths. Dangerous new arrivals, a sinister figure, a shocking revelation. From Season 4 premieres April 19th on MGM Plus. Some doors should remain closed.
Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War question and answer episode. As a reminder, I generally release these episodes every time I have enough questions to make them happen, and so you can send your questions in to historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com. This time we have a good mix of First and Second World War questions across a wide range of topics, so let's jump right in. The first question comes from listener Christopher, who has a question that I am assuming was the result of the podcast series on the Spanish Civil War. Quote, I've always been told that Republican guerrillas held out until the early 1950s after the fall of Madrid and the destruction of the Spanish Republic. Is that true? You're absolutely correct that there were scattered Republican guerrillas that would continue to resist the new Francoist regime, not just until the 1950s, but even into the 1960s. After the end of the Civil War, there were large groups of people who had fought for the Republic that would refuse to surrender to the victorious nationalists. They would continue into the Second World War years, although we don't have a ton of documentary evidence about the overall scale of this resistance. This seems to mostly be due to a combination of the long Francoist regime and the fact that the Second World War happened. But the key fact is that simply they existed throughout those years. Oddly enough, even though it was further from the end of the Civil War, we have better information starting at about 1943. This was primarily caused by two reasons. The first was that by 1943, it seemed clear that if Germany would not soon be defeated, it was not going to continue to rampage over its enemies like it had during the early years of the war. When this was combined with the heavy reverses suffered by the Italians throughout the Mediterranean, culminating in the invasion of Italy itself, it seemed like a good time to be fighting fascists. The second major reason for the resurgence of anti-Franco rebels was the infusion of both equipment and manpower from elsewhere in Europe. After Franco had been victorious during the Civil War, many Republicans, instead of surrendering to Franco, had fled to France, either across the border or via some sort of sea-based transport. Then during the Second World War, many of those same Spanish Republicans had dedicated their time to fighting the good fight against the German Nazis, who they saw as pretty much the same thing as the Spanish nationalists that they had previously been fighting. But then, starting in 1944, with France clearly on the path to liberation, and then the Allies invaded, liberating parts of France, many of those Spanish exiles then went back to Spain. They brought with them equipment, of course, but just as valuably, they brought back experience. There were even a few cases of these men and women mounting what seemed like more standard military attacks against the Francoists, particularly across the border, where in late 1944, thousands of these fighters would launch a raid into northern Spain. They would not accomplish their biggest goal, which was to try and get the Allies committed to extending their campaigns into Spain, but they were certainly fighting. Unfortunately for all of the guerrillas that remained in Spain after the end of the Second World War, they were in for nothing but disappointment in the years that followed. They had hoped that the Allies would eventually attack Franco, but instead they would do the exact opposite. And the years after the Second World War would see Franco accepted into the general political structures of Western Europe as they reorientated themselves against what they saw as the greater threat, the Soviet Union. This meant that back in Spain, there was no longer any endgame for the guerrillas, at least in early years. There was always hope that the general upheaval of the World War would have an impact on Spain, but that did not seem to be happening after the war ended. This resulted in a massive decrease in overall numbers during the last years of the 1940s. Then during the 1950s, most of the remaining groups, which were often shadows of their former selves, would attempt to leave Spain for France, North Africa, or other destinations. There were tiny groups that made it into the 1960s, with the last anarchist guerrilla being killed in August 1963, and the last guerrilla overall, I believe, being shot in March 1965. It was certainly a long period of fighting against the fascists, although by 1965, it had been a long time since there was hope of any real change. Next up, we have a second question from Christopher on a completely different topic. Quote, I'm working on a book for local history, and I wanted to know if you had ever heard of or know of any sources that discussed James Doolittle's raiders while they were in Eglin Air Force Field training for their big attack on Tokyo. Have you heard of any sources like that, or could you point me in the right direction? Now, there are several books out there, and then some archival stuff scattered around various archives here in the United States, but I wanted to point out two oral histories that I think are interesting. Obviously, oral histories come with an entire list of disclaimers due to the nature of discussing events decades after they occur, and as the people who experience them are getting up there in age, but they can still be useful. One of them is by Richard Dick Cole, who was actually Doolittle's co-pilot on the mission. The other is from James Herb Maciah, who was a bombardier navigator on one of the planes. Just to pull in my favorite bit of his oral history, quote, I don't recall specifically asking for volunteers, but I think it was sort of an attitude of, if you're still going with us, you are a volunteer. The only thing he said about the degree of danger was that thing of, out of the three of you, one or two will be lost, or something like that. I think the thing that was most influential, and it certainly was on me and some of my friends, any time we would have someone like Doolittle come and take us over, it would be a very, very important and a very, very dangerous operation. He immediately was the boss, end quote. I bring that quote up because one of my favorite things to see in oral histories is when the subject kind of maybe doesn't completely dismiss a well-known event, like Doolittle's 1 out of 3 comment, but certainly makes it clear that they are not 100% sure it was actually said like it was attributed. I think that's one of the interesting things you can get out of oral histories is specific people's sort of viewpoints on specific historical events, and sometimes they cast doubt a little bit on some of those really nice sounding quotes, like maybe they didn't actually happen. But that's history and myth and stories, it's all of it history. I've included links to those two oral histories in the show notes for Christopher, or anybody else who wants to check them out. They're available for free online. Next up, we have a question from listener Brad around some of the things I mentioned in the Yugoslavia episodes around transportation and the difficulty of moving troops around Yugoslavia. Quote, I hear what you're saying about the defending army having woefully inadequate transport, but I wonder if the Axis invading forces struggle as well because of the poor infrastructure within Yugoslavia. What I mean is that they aren't lacking transport as much as the defenders, but still had traffic jams and headaches. Brad brings up a comment I made in one of the Yugoslavia episodes about the state of Yugoslav infrastructure and how that impacted the ability of the defending forces to move around and to react to German attacks. Brad is absolutely correct in that infrastructure deficiencies were a concern for German planners and did impact the course of the campaign. However, Yugoslavia was simply not large enough for it to be a big enough problem for the Germans, like it would be in the Soviet Union. For the defenders, there were a few challenges, some of which were directly related to infrastructure, while others were only partially related. The first was that the Germans had more armored and motorized units, which were always going to be faster moving than foot-bound infantry, even in cases where the roads were not perfect and plentiful. But more importantly, the Germans knew where they were going to attack, and therefore the Yugoslav forces would have to respond to where those attacks were launched. This meant that they would have limited time in which to respond to whatever the Germans were doing, making infrastructure and force mobility even more important. When a nation was being attacked by an army in the Second World War, the ability to quickly react in the very first hours and days of the attack were crucial, because once an attack got rolling, it was very difficult to catch up to it, particularly against armored forces like what the Germans had. You can see that happening in Poland and France and Yugoslavia, and in the early stages in Russia. Basically, the Germans would attack at a specific point, and the defending army would not be able to rush in reinforcements fast enough to respond. This was the entire problem the French had when Guderian's units at Sedan and other panzer units made it over the Meuse. They could not react fast enough, and it let the German armored units just kind of go on a rampage. The same thing would happen in Yugoslavia, and even if the infrastructure was not perfect for the German attack, for the Yugoslav forces, it also did not support the massive pulse of mobility that they needed at the very moment of the German attack to respond to what the Germans were doing. Then the size of Yugoslavia did not give them time to recover because the Germans never really had to stop or take a break to deal with any issues like they would in the Soviet Union, the pauses that would allow the Red Army to recover during late 1941. As you might guess, I love history podcasts, but there's something special about going to the place where the history happened. Chase History Tours can help take you there. Chase History Tours has a special early bird rate on their 2026 Christmas Markets and History Tour, which is a 10-day adventure through France, Germany, and Austria. The founder of Chase History Tours, Will Clark, will accompany you through Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Munich, and other gorgeous locations. During the 10-day tour, an entire day is dedicated to the important role that Nuremberg would play before, during, and after the Second World War, including a visit to the Nazi Party rally grounds and Courtroom 600, where the Nuremberg trials took place. You'll also have some time in Munich, should you wish to visit a certain beer hall of Push fame. Will has partnered with local historians in each location, and the group will be small, capped at just 16 guests. That's a small group, local experts, really cool-looking history markets, the footsteps of history. There's a lot to like here. You can head over to chasehistorytours.com to see a full itinerary of this trip, and also to reserve your spot. And if you reserve that spot before April 15th, 2026, you could save 10% on your rate through their early bird special. That is chasehistorytours.com, and look for their Christmas Markets and History Tour.
This episode is brought to you by Beneful. Dogs of the world, lend me your ears, snoots, and little toe beans. We've been sitting and staying for boring food for too long. It's time to demand high-quality ingredients, fresh from the pantry. Together with Beneful freshly prepared meals, we can start a mealtime revolution. Can I get a woof woof? Kick boring in the bowl with Beneful freshly prepared meals. Visit Purina.com/Beneful to shop now.
Finally, we have my favorite type of question from listener Scott, dealing with both the large topic of how we evaluate military commanders, along with how my views on history have evolved over the course of my podcasting. In History of the Great War, you were pretty sympathetic to British generals and leadership, but in World War II, we see the British lurch from disaster to disaster, often of their own making. In both wars, it's the same aristocrat class making bad call after bad call. Has your thinking changed at all since then? I personally can't get past Passchendaele happening after Bite and Hold had been shown to work, and it continuing long after it was clear it wasn't going to work. They seemed to realize they were in a war of attrition, but didn't seem to prioritize conserving their troops. Instead, they seemed to be trying to win a dashing Nelsonian victory, out of touch with reality. The Germans seemed very pragmatic and effective with innovations like the Hindenburg Line and stormtroopers, whereas Entente innovation seemed much clunkier and took many tries to get right. Okay, so I've gotten emails about this topic over the years, several of them over the years. And for those who did not listen to History of the Great War, I generally don't buy into the lions led by donkeys structure of the narrative around the First World War. I don't think the generals on any side were some kind of geniuses, but my evaluation of particularly the Western Front is that every army was in an impossible position throughout the entire war on the Western Front. It didn't matter what they did, how they structured their attacks, or how they tried to innovate in an offensive. There was not a solution available that could solve the problem of the trenches that had developed after the race to the sea at the end of 1914. This causes me to generally put less blame on many of the British and French commanders that were pressured to attack throughout the war. This pressure was largely political. The French could not sit idly by while the Germans occupied large and important areas of France, and their allies, the British, could not sit around while the French attacked. My biggest criticism of the British and French generals, with a few exceptions, is more around their optimism. If they had been more realistic about what they could and could not have accomplished after 1914, fewer lives would have been lost. Maybe. The British and French generals were constantly making tactical innovations throughout the war, and one of the major British tactical innovations was the bite and hold tactics, which were most successfully used during the Battle of Third Ypres by General Plumer. Through these tactics, they would just throw a tremendous amount of artillery ammunition into the German lines, and then only advance as far as the artillery could support, then dig in and hold the ground. It did work, and it caused more casualties than the British sustained, and the Germans did not seem to have a real answer. But the Germans also had a huge amount of time to come up with those answers because it would take time for bite and hold to have a meaningful impact on the course of the war. Bite and hold was also not a panacea that would solve all issues, with the British forces still sustaining casualties, although at least they were less than the Germans. It was also unclear if it could have been sustained for any real length of time, given the amount of artillery ammunition it required, and the fact that the artillery and supplies would have to, in some way, deal with the destruction of the environment that it caused, which would make it difficult to keep it moving forward. This was a problem that Plumer didn't really run into during Third Ypres in a major way, because he just didn't have enough time, he didn't progress far enough with his bite and hold to run into the problem of pulverizing the terrain on his way forward. I think one of the reasons that bite and hold has such a high reputation is because people think it was drastically less costly, but I'm not sure we have a large enough body of evidence to make that statement. In 1917, the British were able, through weapons and innovation, to launch something like the Battle of Passchendaele, which resulted in roughly equal casualties on both sides. The estimates are broad, but they're basically the same-ish on each side. Now, Passchendaele has a horrible reputation, as mentioned in the question. I cannot believe they launched an attack in the state, especially later on during Passchendaele, during the actual Passchendaele attacks or the Battle of Third Ypres. I cannot believe that they launched attacks in the weather and the mud that they were doing it, but the casualties were roughly the same on both sides. The Battle of Brunswick, which was the textbook bite and hold by Plumer, the Germans suffered around 35,000 casualties, while the Allies suffered 20,000. Certainly better, but that is with the Germans making many mistakes that made their situation much worse and not really understanding how or what the British were doing with those attacks. And that caused them to make some serious mistakes in reaction to the bite and hold that I don't think would have continued over the long course of a long bite and hold offensive. Scott also mentions the German leaders, and while I am sometimes less critical of them than the British and French, I also find myself less impressed with what the Germans accomplished throughout the war, particularly after 1914 on the Western Front, than some people are. There were two major benefits that the Germans had over the British and French when it came specifically to attacking and innovating their tactics. The most important was that they had other areas outside of the Western Front to test and experiment with ideas. The Eastern Front did not have the same challenges as the Western Front due to lower troop density, lower infrastructure density, those kinds of things. This meant that attacks simply had a greater chance of success. The front line was easier to get through, and it was more difficult for the defender to rush in reinforcements to close a breach. As the armies led by Hindenburg and Ludendorff launched these attacks, they were always sort of innovating over their ideas. That's what everybody was doing. And this would eventually lead to stormtroopers, artillery advancements, and other ideas. Then when changes were made and Hindenburg and Ludendorff came to the West, they brought those ideas and the men who would execute them with them to the Western Front. The Entente did not really have this luxury. The French could not, politically, send their army off somewhere else to fight while France was occupied. And while some British leaders would try to advocate for other areas of attack, like from Salonika in the Balkans, it was a difficult argument to make given the clear importance of France and the Western Front. The arc of the Entente offensives are full of innovations, though. If you compare something like Loos to the First Day of the Somme, to even the failures at Third Ypres and Passchendaele, and then to the 100 Days attacks at the end of the war, they were structured completely differently. The British and French actually got really, really good at getting through the first set of German trenches, which is one of the reasons that German defensive tactics had to change over time. They were not changing because they wanted to, but because the Entente was getting too good at what they were doing. It first pushed them into elastic defense because the Entente artillery concentrations became too great for them to man the front line. Then they got pushed from elastic defense back to strong front lines when the Entente generals moved towards those bite and hold tactics or limited objectives towards the end of the war. It was an ebb and flow as they both reacted to the most recent round of innovations from each other. Both sides deserve some credit for realizing that they needed to change what they were doing and then executing on those changes over time. I do think the Germans get too much credit though, because they had the advantage of the defense, where they were able to take advantage of the exact things that made offensives so challenging: time and distance, with it always being easier to seal breaches in the line on the Western Front rather than to create and exploit them. Something that would have a major impact on the German offensives in the spring of 1918, when the Entente was able to reposition their troops rapidly to contain the German spring offensives. I also think that a lot of our views of the German tactics and offensives on the Western Front are tinged and influenced by this idea that the German spring 1918 offensives were these like wild successes. And I would argue strongly against that. I think they were failures in the same way that the earlier Entente offensives were failures. They had just gotten a little better at the opening phases, and the British and French were really bad at defending those opening phases of an attack. But a full conversation about that's kind of a whole nother episode probably in scope. But this was a two-war question, and it relates to the Second World War as well. And I think when it comes to British generals during the Second World War, I'm not sure I'm at the point where I feel comfortable saying that the challenges that the British had during the first 2 years of the war were bad generalship. I don't think they were amazing, but the blame for British failures does not fall on their shoulders in my estimation. I would instead blame the British aristocratic leaders back in London for almost every single failure, from France to Norway to a lesser extent in North Africa, and then Greece and Crete, and then beyond. The British political leaders continuously put the British military in the worst possible positions. Surrounded in France, poorly supported in Norway, thrown into a disaster in Greece without time to prepare. It was just a mess all around, and not one that, I think, falls on anybody outside of the British government or high command. I think the one example we have had on the podcast where the British Army was put in a good strategic position in North Africa, they did pretty well with Operation Compass, although I know that will turn around in North Africa in the very near future on the podcast. Now, I am anticipating my views on British generalship will decline as the war progresses and their material and strategic advantages continue to grow, although they'll still continue to have problems sort of executing on some of those things. But for right now, I'm not trying to blame the generals. For now, I'm putting most of the blame in London, both on the political leadership that I think was making some poor strategic decisions, but also on the British military leaders at the highest level, both before the war and then during its early war years. They were also not setting up the British military for success, and you can see that in every campaign we've covered on the podcast so far. As always, thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who sent in questions. I think I already have enough questions for another question and answer episode after this one, but there's always room in the future. And again, I'm always up for doing them as long as I have enough questions.